In all the years I've studied the Bible, I have never noticed a significant person in the lineage of Jesus, a significant person in the line of King David and ultimately the Messiah. Today in our study, we're going to see this character and how prominent he is in the line of the Messiah. And we're going to ask ourselves some questions about the details of his genealogy as we see it in the book of First Chronicles and why it's there and what it says to us. So today, we're going to be talking about Christ's relative you've never heard of when we come right back. Well, hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study, how to study it, how to mark it, how to apply it to your life. And we're glad you're with us today. Hope you hit the like button and the subscribe button. That's important. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are going to continue our series in First Chronicles. This is a very difficult book to read at first. The first 9 chapters are nothing but names. And we've talked about that, the genealogies of First Chronicles. So this is leading up to David. And I saw a person today, Kyle, that I have to confess, all the years I've studied the Bible, I didn't recognize this name. And it's a significant name in the line of Christ. And I had never really seen it until I did this study in First Chronicles, which just goes to show you, you can learn some things from these genealogies. I entitled this lesson, Christ's Relative That You've Never Heard of. Okay.
All right.
Now, a lot of the relatives, we know Boaz and we know Jesse, and a lot of those names we'll remember. Perez, who is David's great-grandfather. But I want to talk about a relative that maybe you've never heard of before. And we're going to start, but before we get into the actual verses in First Chronicles, we're going to turn to 2 sections that are summations of this chapter from the lineage up to David leading to the Messiah, okay?
Okay.
And this will help us put some of these names we're going to look at in a minute into perspective. The first place I want you to turn is Ruth chapter 4 from verse 18 to verse 22. And we're going to see some names we're going to recognize as we go along.
Okay. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, fathered Ram. Ram fathered and Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
Okay. Now, that is the same kind of chronology. We're going to see this in the genealogy here, but it's very condensed. He doesn't go into the next generations of any of these things. We'll see that as we're going here in this chapter. But now I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 1, and I want you to look from verse 3 to verse 6.
All right. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram, fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon, fathered Salmon, fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, and Obed fathered Jesse, fathered David the king.
Okay, now one of the things that I noticed in these verses was a name that I had never really paid attention to. And there's a lot of names there in those summaries. But if you use the summary of Ruth, most of those names are pretty familiar to us.
Yep.
But there is one name, even in Ruth, that I had never really paid attention to. And First Chronicles chapter 2 makes it pretty clear that it is an important name in the line of the Messiah. And that's the name Hezron. Okay? Now, I hope you have your finger still in it, but Go back to either Matthew or Ruth, either one you wanted to, and just read that again.
Okay. Here's the Ruth one. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram.
Okay.
Ram.
So right there. And then it goes on Ram, Aminadab, and Aminadab onto and through you get to Boaz and okay. I had never really paid attention to who Hezron was. And I want us to notice in this chapter, if we go from verse 18 to the end of the chapter, and there's some interesting things to start to notice. And one of them is Hezron. He's mentioned up in verse 5 when it's first talking about the father of Caleb. And it mentions the next generation was Hezron. Okay.
Okay.
Now, Hezron is mentioned from verse 18 all the way down to 41 is this extended family of Hezron. And I never realized he was so significant. And there's
it's a lot of verses dedicated just to him.
Did you notice anything else about this section from 18 down to 54?
The name Gilead stuck out to me.
Okay. Any others? Did any others jump at you?
I mentioned Obed.
Okay.
Obed again. Wasn't Obed in the one we just?
Yeah, they're different names, and it's interesting. We'll see a couple of things I just want to point out that are strange about Hebrew and about some of these families.
Okay.
Not so unusual today, but we have to pay attention. Now, one of the things we see, for example, you mentioned Gilead. Look down at verse 22. And Segub became the father of Jerah, who had 23 cities in the land of Gilead. Now, we've talked before about how a lot of these descendants in these genealogies ended up being the name of areas, of territories.
Right, yeah.
Gilead is a person who become a whole region of cities is named after this person.
Okay.
We're going to see that some more in this area. Now, you and I earlier in chapter 1 and chapter 2 saw that people began to be known as areas, okay, as territories. Okay. But we're going to see something interesting in the rest of this chapter, in that now the people are going to start to be named cities, not territories.
So it's narrowing in scope?
Yeah, so it's the territories are becoming narrower, and they're territories that are going to be pointed out that become familiar again in the Bible story of the New Testament and the Messiah. So let's go on here. Let's look.
All right.
Did you notice anything else? Anything else jump out at you besides the names of those familiar people? A hint here, because I colored them in.
Okay. Is it the fact that Hezron had multiple wives, or
yes,
had a concubine, I guess?
Earlier in First Chronicles, it was very rare that a woman was mentioned. But now with Hezron on to David, the women become very important. They're mentioned a lot. And even the concubines, who aren't really wives, are mentioned. And the reason for that is because the seed of being a Jew was not counted through the men. It was counted through, remember in the promise of Genesis, the promise of the Messiah was counted through the seed of the woman.
Okay.
So as the family got mixed in with other races even, it became important, more and more important, to trace the women.
Okay.
And so what you see here from here, and we'll notice it as we go. I'm just going to bring it out. We're not going to talk a lot about details, but I want to show you that all of a sudden, women become very important. And if you notice in the yellow here, these are the women, okay? Look down at, you get Hezron, and he produces through Azubah, he produces Jereth. And then when Azubah died, Caleb married another woman, Ephrath, which we're going to talk more about in a minute, who bore him Hur. I love Hur because it reminds me of the movie Ben-Hur.
Yeah, I thought of that too.
Yeah, but this is just a good Jewish name. And he became the father of Uri. Uri becomes the father of Basil. And afterwards, Hezron went into the daughter of Machir. Now, you notice this is talking about a woman, but she's not named.
Okay.
But down here in verse 24, Abijah is named. And this is probably the daughter of Machir. Okay?
Okay.
Now, Machir is not Jewish. He's not in the line. Okay? But he produces Gilead. And through Machir, who gives a daughter to Hezron, he becomes, says right up here, Gesher and Aram took the towns of Jar from them with Kenath and its villages, even 60 cities. All of these were the sons of Machir, the father of Gilead. And so we have that name, Gilead, show up as a territory. Later we hear Jesus is the balm of Gilead.
Okay. Yeah.
And then it goes back to Hezron. And Hezron goes into another woman, Abijah, and Abijah produces Aaron's wife, bore him Asher's the father of Tekoa. That's the lineage of Hezron up to this point. And then it goes to Hezron's brother, Jeremiah. Okay. Now, very interesting. The firstborn of Hezron were Ram, the firstborn, then Jemiel is Hezron's son, his oldest son. And then you get Ram, and then the others are not even mentioned. Ram produces the sons of Ram, right? So Ram, the firstborn of Jeremiel, okay? So you start to see that the chronicler is not interested in all of the sons. He starts to trace just the sons that are going to produce the line that's going to produce an impact on Messiah. Okay?
Yeah.
So once you start to trace these, you go, oh, he had 5 sons, but the only one or maybe 2 of the sons have further genealogies. The rest of them are just left out.
Yeah.
You go, why is he leaving people out? Because they're not in the direct line producing either the Messiah or the priests. Make sense?
And it's interesting too with Ram, I was looking because Ram fathered Aminadab, but when he goes into verse 27, the sons of Ram were Maz, Jamin, and Eker. So it actually skips over Aminadab.
Yeah.
Because it's already talked about him above.
Yeah. So it jumps around.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting here also we see Ram, this Ram in verse 25 is not the Ram of, go up to verse 9.
Oh, so they're different Rams.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go up to verse 9.
All right. Verse 9 says, now the sons of Hezron who were born to him were Jeremiel, Ram, and Chelubai.
Okay. So Ram is Jeremiel's brother.
Okay.
Right?
And he names his son.
And then it goes here, the firstborn of Hezron, okay, the sons of were Ram. So now we're getting Jeremiel, who's the brother of Ram, is now the father of Ram.
Okay. So it's the uncle and the nephew have the same.
Exactly. Name. So this he's named after Uncle Ram. So now you get even more confusion. So you got to pay attention to whose father and whose son is this. And we start to see this now. Ram, there's 2 things very interesting here. We're not going to go to it, but Jeremiel becomes a territory. If you go to 1 Samuel 27:10, we're not going to do it. It talks about the territory of the Jeremielites.
Okay.
So the descendants of Jeremiel become a territory, and that's later mentioned in the scriptures in 1 Samuel. in this story of David again. So we start to see these very interesting things. And here in verse 27, he's trying to clarify. So he's saying the sons of Ram, who was the firstborn of Jerahmeel. So he can't be the son of Hezron.
Right.
This Ram is the firstborn of Jerahmeel. That
Right. Yeah.
all right. Now, Ram is then forgotten. And then it goes on. Jerahmeel had another wife whose name was Atra, and she was the mother of Onam. Onam goes on, and he fathers the sons of Oman were this. And then it only follows Jada down in verse 32.
Yep.
So we see it's clear he's not trying to establish an exhaustive genealogy. He's just following the key people.
Okay.
And he says, now, Abishur right here was one of the sons of Onam, right? Who was one of the sons of Jerahmeel, his next wife. So they're half brothers of Ram and those guys, different mother. They go on, and the name of Abishur's wife was Abihail, and she bore him some more guys. But she bore him those guys, but those guys are no longer mentioned.
Yeah, it just skips over them.
Yeah. So it's helpful to I tried to do it with these lines. It goes down a generation here, but then it jumps back to Jada, who is up here, jumps back down, and he was the brother of Shammai. Okay.
All right.
And the sons of Jada, who was the brother of Shammai, were Jonathan and Jether. But Jether died without sons. So the line goes back to Jonathan. You following me so far?
Yeah.
All right. So we're seeing now, all of a sudden, there's an interesting transition in the next verse. And then there's a kind of a deviation from all these sons of Hezron. Okay. The Jewish sons. Now, I want you to see the deviation. Read verse 34.
Now, Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. And Sheshan had an Egyptian servant whose name was Jarha.
Now, and it says, Sheshan gave his daughter to Jarha. So what nationality is Jarha?
Egyptian.
He's Egyptian. And now it's going to follow that, okay, the daughter of Jarha, his servant in marriage, and she bore him Attai. Attai became the father of Nathan. Nathan became the father of Jabad, and go on and on. Now, there's a couple of interesting things. An Egyptian is introduced into the line of the Jews, okay?
Okay.
And these are mentioned specifically to be inclusive of the line of the Jews through the daughter of the Jew, okay?
Okay.
Their children, the daughter's children, fathered by an Egyptian, would still have been considered having Jewish lineage.
Okay.
Because it came through the women. Now, another thing to notice, all of a sudden, there's a change in the lineage, and that from Sheshan, who produced the daughter, who produced Jerah, and they produce all these other things, there's another change from verse 35 on down for quite a while. And what you notice is it's only single sons in the line. They may have had other sons, but he's not even interested in mentioning the other sons. He's just going through this line, and he becomes the father in verse 37, becomes the father of Obed, right? That's a name that could be familiar. And they become the father of Jehu. So this is the Egyptian line of single sons produced by probably grandson of Hezron. Okay.
Interesting.
So all of a sudden, there's a whole branch of the family that's included, but they're really Egyptian.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And some of those names become prominent names in the genealogies of the Jews. Now, if we continue on from verse 42 on, now we're done talking directly about Hezron, and we're talking about one of Hezron's kids, Caleb. Now, I want you to notice something important, and that is the pronunciation of Caleb. Go to verse 18 and 19, because if you're reading along in verse 42 and you come to the name Caleb and you go, wait a minute, I haven't read that name before. But it says the sons of Caleb, who was the brother of Jeremiel. Do you see that there?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So you go, wait a minute. I look back and I look at Hezron's family and I look at the brothers of Jeremiel and I don't see Caleb. So what is going on? So I want you to look here.
Oh, it looks like you mentioned verse 18, right? Because verse 18 says, now Caleb, the son of Hezron. So he's the son of Hezron?
Caleb. Yeah. And earlier on, he's mentioned as Calubroth or something like that. And they're all the same names.
Yeah,
they did quite a bit. They in the Old Testament, they'd write a Jewish name, and in another chapter, his name would be slightly different, almost like nicknames or names that he's better known as.
Okay.
So it may be Calebetha, but he was better known as Caleb.
Yeah, in verse 9, it says, the sons of Hezron who were born to him were Jeremiel, Ram, and Chelubai.
Okay, and Chelubai, if you take the CH and pronounce it as a K, it's Klubai,
okay,
which is close to Caleb. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think that's where my notes were that I was looking for. But this is a brother of Jeremiel. And the fact that he switches the names, he makes it real clear. This is the brother of Jeremiel. Now, I want us to read, and I'm sorry for doing this to you, but no, I'll read it. I'll read 42, 43, and 44. Now, the sons of Caleb, the brother of Jeremiel, were Mesha, his firstborn, who was the father of Ziph, and his son, Ziph's son, was Marishah, and the father of Hebron. Now, is Hebron familiar to you?
It rings a bell.
Hebron becomes the name of a territory and a city.
Okay.
And it says the sons of Hebron were Korah, Tapua, and Shema. Now, what's interesting is if you go over, there's a change here because up to this point, these descendants become areas, right? They almost become nations. Now, all of a sudden, under the lineage of Caleb, who was Hezron's son, under his genealogies, we start to see relatives who become the names of cities, not nations. And what I did was I did a little study on these. They become familiar to us as cities. And we're not going to look there, but if you go to Joshua 15, you'll see in Joshua 15, 24, 26, 34, 44, and 54, and then Joshua 18, 27, they all mention these guys, but they mention them as cities.
Okay.
Connected to the neighboring areas around Judah. So what that tells us is the whole Middle East were all cousins and cousins of cousins. And even though they were cousins, they were in the lineage, there were areas that were enemies of the line of David. Okay.
Okay.
And later resisted the Jews when they came and said, hey, can we have some help? And they said, no, we're of a different line. Okay. You're way too far distant cousins.
Okay.
Now, what I took away from this was this focus on the importance of a guy we've never heard of, Hezron, and how in these genealogies of Ruth and the genealogy you read even in Matthew, which I've read that genealogy a zillion times and never paid attention to Hezron.
Yep.
And it was through Hezron and Hezron's kids that an inclusive area of Gentiles were brought in and incorporated into the inclusiveness of the Jewish nation.
That's cool.
So when we get to the line of Christ, as we saw in Matthew, we're going to see Gentiles all over the place in the line of Christ. We're going to see prostitutes. We're going to see all kinds of people who, through the line of Messiah, he includes into his family. And it starts with a guy named Hezron, who was the son of Perez, right?
Yeah.
So it's in a direct line through this guy that we've never really paid attention to. And it's just interesting that Second Chronicles really pays attention to him.
Yeah.
And goes into pretty good detail about his descendants, even to the point where this isn't a son, but it's a daughter. And the fact that as a Jewish man, he would give his daughter, he didn't have any sons. So who does he give his daughter to? Another Jewish guy?
An Egyptian.
He gives his son to an Egyptian servant.
Yeah.
Which shows the status of a servant can literally become a member of the household.
Yeah.
And here is a Jewish man who says, I don't have any sons and I want some grandkids. So I'm going to give my daughter to an Egyptian servant who's going to produce a significant line in the line of the Messiah. So
that's cool.
The accused racism that the Old Testament is all about, the racism of the Jews, and the only people that counted in God's economy was the Jews. The Gentiles were just second-class people. This really shows early on in the book of First Chronicles an inclusiveness that we should embrace in our own lives and say that in the New Testament, how did the Jews consider the Gentiles in the first century, in Jesus' time?
In Jesus' time, most didn't like them much, right?
Yeah, they basically said it's the Jews and the dogs, which they forgot by the time that Jesus comes on the scene. They forget the Abrahamic covenant, and the Abrahamic covenant, which started out this whole thing in First Chronicles, this whole lineage was Abraham.
Yeah.
And he said, Abraham, you're going to become a great nation. And through you and this great nation, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed.
Yeah, so it was always meant to spread outward.
So the covenant with Abraham, the first Jew, was always through the Jewish line, I'm going to produce a blessing to all the people of the world. By the time Jesus is on the scene, the Jews had become very antisocial to anybody that wasn't a Jew, and they were not inclusive. Even though in the book of Matthew, which was written for the Jew, the lineage of King David and ultimately the Messiah shows all kinds of people of not so good reputation and people who weren't even Jewish.
Yep.
That's a neat story for us. And that's an application we can take of, let's not become as Christians, let's not become the us and them mentality.
Yeah.
It should be, how can we, who are believers in the Messiah, how can we bless other peoples who may not be believers yet?
Yeah.
I think
that's great.
I'll take that away from this section.
That's a good takeaway.
So let's stop with verse 42. So
yeah, it's a good study.
God so loved the world, including Egyptians and Jews and non-Jews and concubines, and God loved them enough that when John the Baptist sees Jesus, he says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the Jews. No, he takes away the sins of the world.
Yeah.
Including these very diverse lines. Today we've been talking about the lineage of the Messiah, leading up to King David and ultimately King David's heir of Jesus, the Messiah, the king who's going to rule forever. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called Being in Christ's Family, and it comes out of the book of Mark, and I hope you enjoy it. It's along the same lines of this very inclusive genealogy we've seen. We're going to continue our study next week. And until then, God bless you.